Aphoristic appendage to On Truthtelling. 1151 to 1200. 1151. COVID-19 aphorism. Throughout history there have been people who, for various reasons, have been treated as pariahs and who, to use the current vernacular, have known what it is to be socially distanced. Now we have a situation unique in human history in which virtually everyone in the world has this status to some degree or other. As long as it persists, one can imagine a few true outcasts of society, those who live on the street, for example, asking, why are they avoiding each other? Why are they doing what they usually do to us? Hey ma'am. Hey, mister. How does it feel, ma'am? How does it feel, mister? 1152. COVID-19 aphorism, a pandemic of lying by various or virtually all political actors in the Western world. A pandemic of horrendous accumulated debt over many years. A pandemic of hype in the media that never ceases. A pandemic of public complicity in all this because few want to see the writing on the wall. And, finally, a pandemic of fear and panic, let's hope not violence, caused by a little virus with some distinctly unsettling traits that, in turn, causes the whole house of cards to collapse. 1153. COVID-19 aphorism, Brave New World. One day the planet caught a cold and, all of a sudden, it turned itself into a giant hospital. 1154. The aphorism as way of thought ends where anger, argument, and action begin. Its life is the peaceful contemplation of what has been, what is, or what might be. Its death is the apocalyptic war or event that, as one great and final epigram or epitaph, ends all. 1155. Being bested in an argument doesn't equal being in the wrong for the same reason that having the right position doesn't equal being in a position to argue it. 1156. I may not know much about economics, but one thing I do know is that both socialism and capitalism are capable of bringing good arguments to the table. How is one to decide between them? Perhaps there's no deciding apart from what historical circumstances determine. The arguments would then come into play merely as great facilitators of radical change. That would mean the arguments themselves are like two types of currency, each having its turn being recognized as true coin or rejected as false money. 1157. The difference between a philosopher and a professor of philosophy is that the second is also an official who, when speaking in this capacity, is that much less a philosopher. 1158. It has been reported by unnamed sources that the powers that be have launched a worldwide social experiment to determine how many and how far people are willing to police themselves based on some ill-founded fear or exaggerated danger. What powers that be? Who is carrying out this experiment? Well, I suppose the rich and powerful. Don't you think there's something to it? I don't like conspiracy theories. If it's a social experiment, it's all of us who are carrying it out. It's all of us who, for one reason or another, have decided to live dangerously. Live dangerously. Isn't it exactly the opposite? People are hunkered down all over the world. They're afraid to go out of their homes. They're petrified of some enemy that, like a ghost, they can't see. How can this be called living dangerously? They're risking destroying the world's economy, that's certainly living dangerously. They're risking losing the comfortable lifestyle they've always known. Do you really believe what you're saying? No, not at the individual level. People, generally speaking, are cowards. But at the collective level, at the level of the world, at the level of the times and circumstances as zeitgeist, it may be that these people, I don't say all, are taking a chance with their lives. But it could all lead to ruination. How could anyone, for whatever reason, wish this upon themselves? They don't, of course. No one does. Certainly not the rich. But it's happening because people, in their hearts, want change more than they want comfort. Not on an individual level, perhaps, but on the collective. They get tired of the same old world. And the excitement over wars. Falls into the same category. Only now we're all engulfed in this change of worlds. Yes, this is the truly unique thing. 1159. When it comes to managing a new situation dangerously out of control, knowledge and experience not wedded to courage and wisdom are a dead letter. 1160. Compromising one's principles in the face of changing and adverse circumstances is something to which no one is immune. 1161. If everybody did even a modest amount of research, TV journalism would fall into disrepute overnight. 1162. COVID-19 aphorism: never has there been such attention to worldwide mortality as there is today. The only trouble is that, morally, politically, and psychologically speaking, it focuses on a small part of it. People who die from cancer, heart disease, diabetes, tuberculosis, malaria, hunger, murder, suicide, war, traffic accidents, and so on are left entirely out of the picture. 1163. Every time we sit on the white porcelain throne to be found in every home, we get a sharp reminder of how much the high is tied to the low, the pure to the impure. 1164. The majority of people think that, by simply being the majority, they must be in the right. But they are wrong, for, in exceptional times, it is exceptional people, a definite minority, who are in the right. 1165. Politicians and mainstream media are masters of the half-truth or quarter-truth that, under normal circumstances, doesn't get much play or doesn't have much effect on society. But if one or more of these everyday lies becomes an important part of raising a general alarm that itself gets out of hand and becomes ever greater as false alarm, its potential as injurious element in society or, for that matter, the world is enormous. 1166. The most frightening equation in the world is collective intelligence plus collective stupidity equals collective suicide. 1167. Between what we call dead and what we call living, there is a great deal of activity and transmission. A book, for example, is as much the past reaching towards the future and into the present as the other way. 1168. The reason for corruption is that rules bent to gain some significant advantage can easily become rules to be secretly but strictly followed. Extending from those who are simply greedy to those in need or distress, a sometimes small, sometimes large number of people find themselves playing a double game that, as it becomes more and more habit, preference, or poison of choice, leaves them with no desire to lose whatever is gained by it. On the other hand, the loss of character that ensues is usually borne quite well apart from anything that may turn it into something much worse for them, namely, loss of reputation. 1169. Professional critics rarely if ever engage in self-criticism. To this extent, they fall short of being those who tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. 1170. Let all those who would like to hear a modern-day parable read my story. It comes at a time when I think it could shed some light on human behavior, specifically, on collective human behavior. You see, on the one hand, it all depends on upbringing or training and, on the other, conditions or circumstances. If the two match, everything goes wonderfully. If they don't, a breakdown occurs that, if we're honest, should not be taken lightly. The incident I wish to speak of happened some 30 years ago. It was at an airport and I was a taxi driver. It was on a Sunday when far fewer taxis than normal were on the road. For some reason, a huge passenger plane made an unexpected landing at the Winnipeg International Airport. There were no taxis in the airport corral because another passenger plane had landed shortly before. As a consequence, hundreds of passengers poured out of the terminal and, encumbered with their luggage, spread out over a large area. Patiently they waited for some taxis to show up and whisk them home after a long and tiring flight. So patient were they at the outset, I imagine, and patient were they, most of them, at any rate, when I first arrived on the scene. But, putting aside this, imagine my shock when I saw so many people stranded at the airport with no taxi in sight except my own. As soon as I came into view, dozens of people from all sections of the spread-out crowd started waving at me, giving me the impression that they wanted me to choose the one whom I thought was most in need. What followed, however, was more a combination of two instinctive and very individual moves, a sort of action and reaction. The first person to step away from the crowd to lay claim to my taxi was successful largely because his action instantly prompted me to hit the brakes. A few seconds later, as we drove away, this young man probably thought pretty well of himself. Perhaps he even felt a bit smug. On the other hand, I'm certain that many of the other passengers, at least the ones standing close to him, didn't approve of his actions. After all, surely there were some older or less healthy people who would have benefited greatly by getting away first. The impetuous young man had robbed them of at least one such possibility. No doubt, if he had any remorse about this, he would have quickly got rid of it by thinking about all the other taxis that would soon be arriving at the airport. Yes, I'm sure this was his thought as I drove him to his destination. I don't remember where I dropped him off. After all, this was the very thought I had when, after finishing with this fare, I responded to the dispatcher's insistent demand to pick up passengers still waiting at the airport. Once again, when coming into view of the terminal, I was shocked to see so many people still waiting for a taxi and with none in sight. Honestly speaking, I don't remember who got into my cab this second time, but I'm sure the boarding operation was the more customary thing of people being polite and letting the person or people first in line take the taxi, or else the person or people most in need of it. Notwithstanding this, I experienced once again the strange phenomenon of dozens of people trying to flag me down as my taxi approached the terminal. It couldn't have been a rational response, since there was obviously no reason for me to bypass a great number of other passengers to get to them. Of course, as soon as my cab was occupied, they ceased their frantic waving and once again wore patient but tired expressions on their travel-worn faces. At this point in my story, who wouldn't have a good opinion of these representatives of civilized society? Who wouldn't think that their patience, self-control, tolerance, and, yes, even generosity were defining characteristics? I'm sure that some such thought or thoughts were in my head when I drove my second fare from the airport to his or their destination. I don't remember this trip at all. Now, as I move towards the conclusion of this story, perhaps you will already have an idea of what it must be. This should be particularly true when I tell you that I had to make a third trip to the airport. Perhaps its denouement will even be clearer when I tell you that, once again, I came across a large group of tired and probably hungry passengers. These were people, to say it once again, who were waiting for taxis that, at least in large numbers, never showed up. Finally, if I tell you that, once again, I was the only taxi in sight, you may already know where this story is headed. I don't mean anything particularly sad, tragic, or depressing by saying this. I only mean to bring into view what a great philosopher called the human all too human. Yes, to my great surprise and consternation, pandemonium broke out when these people saw my taxi pull up the third time. They jumped in front of one another in a mad scramble to get to my cab, tear open the doors, and get themselves lodged inside. Some, of course, succeeded in doing this, while the rest, stymied in their attempt to get away after so much waiting, stood around or mulled about, some looking very angry, some looking almost heartbroken, and some with simply a glassy look in their eyes. I have no recollection of who my passengers were on this third trip from the airport. It doesn't really matter. 1170. Has it ever been observed that, on many occasions, a person who is an expert in one area, if he becomes highly popular in the media, quickly morphs into a person who is an expert in virtually all areas? 1171. It could be said that the concept of human rights has been expanded in recent years to include almost every identifiable group as thoroughly and equitably as possible. It could also be said that the subject is controversial in at least some areas where moral and ethical development is uncertain. What makes the situation even more tenuous not only in these areas but in a general way is the fact that, when sensitivities are raised to a certain level, many are ready to downgrade a basic right like freedom of expression to exercise a newly formed one like protection from it. 1172. COVID-19 aphorism. There have been viruses since the beginning of time, and each and every one of us carries around trillions of them every day. What? Do you think the world will be improved by turning everyone into a germaphobe? Rather, it's a recipe for disaster. I put aside all lesser but still important concerns, should ever a pestilence come along greater than the current one. 1173. Oh, it's horrid. Do you see what this person has written? He's basically saying that right now, in the midst of this pandemic, we're willing to sacrifice our economy to protect the sick, vulnerable, and elderly. But one day, in the not-too-distant future, it'll be quite the contrary. We'll be willing to sacrifice them to protect our standard of living. What he's written does seem nightmarish, but it's far from outlandish. There are many writers who, in different ways, have shown what the human race is capable of. Take Michel de Montaigne, for example. What he wrote 400 years ago about different customs and rituals throughout the world would make your hair stand on end. And if you need a more recent example, think of Franz Kafka. There you have a world where bureaucracy runs rampant and is as inhuman as any machine or system you can think of. But what you're saying has nothing to do with our world. It's all about past worlds or fictitious ones. Our world today is, as you know, all about saving the planet. Indeed, a noble-sounding project, to be sure. But one that might take a bit of time. In the meantime, acute scarcity could arise and interfere with these plans. What? Interfere with saving the planet? I think you'll agree our most essential values are food, water, and shelter. It's on this basis everything else is possible. 1174. I heard it said the other day that trying to stop a pandemic with social distancing and masks is like trying to stop a river with a stick. What do you think? That we'll continue to use this stick despite knowing that nature is mightier than us. It's our modern-day magic wand that, in the form of technology and collective action, we think can accomplish miracles. It galls me that so many people are committed to this path of hubris and narcissism. Whom the gods would destroy, they first make mad. And I would add, we are such stuff as dreams are made on, and our little life is rounded with a sleep. Amen. 1175. The main difference between an aphorism and an argument is that, while the first is primarily an attempt to tell the truth one knows or thinks one knows as well as possible, and is therefore somewhat idle because it doesn't go much further, the second is primarily an attempt to tell the truth one thinks others should know. The second is therefore an attempt to win over others, to exercise power, to be useful and active even to the point of risking error by rendering the uncertain certain, the unknown known. 1176. Everybody has the tendency to talk about a particular matter as if they were an expert on it if they have heard somebody else talk about it as an expert and believed every word they said. What is forgotten is that there are few subjects on which the experts agree and probably none on which they agree absolutely. Indeed, there are many on which they have completely opposing views. 1177. COVID-19 aphorism, a sign of the times. It is no longer good form to advise someone to be honest, strong, brave, or truthful but rather safe. 1178. Truthfulness without goodness equals cold-hearted calculation while goodness without truthfulness equals passionate wrong-headedness. 1179. Taken together, truthfulness without goodness and goodness without truthfulness are perdition. 1180. If all those who, moving towards the end of their lives, lived each day as if it could be their last, they would be led less by fear than by fortitude. 1181. COVID-19 aphorism. It is possible that, looking back, historians will write that never has there been such crass stupidity not to mention cravenness shown among so many different sectors of the population as there is today. 1182. COVID-19 aphorism. With respect to certain diseases like influenza, some who catch it will have no symptoms, some will have mild symptoms, some will have severe ones, and some will die. But does anyone think it could be otherwise? 1183. What the media has the power of doing is making what are ultimately fringe events central, at least for a time. 1184. It is argued here that, during the current pandemic, people who don't observe social distancing and other forms of anti-viral behavior are guilty of killing others, specifically those who are both sick and aged, the vulnerable part of society. The person making this argument seems to think it has great force. You mean he says what he says forcefully? With passion and conviction, is that it? Indeed. He definitely wants to get the message out that we should assume our collective responsibility. A lot could be said on this matter, but, if you don't mind, I would like to ask a question. Does the person who makes this argument, which is obviously a morally charged one, does he make it as if he were dealing with a simple matter or a complex one? I mean to say, does he treat the issue of the health and care of the vulnerable part of society in conjunction with the health and care of society as a whole? No, I can't say he does other than make his primary point as forcefully as possible and without any other considerations. Well, is that not an act of bad faith? He is willing to impugn others and urge them to accept either a collective guilt or a collective responsibility while reducing the health and care of society to the health and care of one small part of it. A. He seems to think that they are one and the same. B. But does he argue it? If he doesn't argue it, then, by virtue of trying to put others in an extremely bad light, he himself must be acting in a less than virtuous way. A. I don't think he, as a man who has always shown the highest integrity, would accept this charge. However, it's true that at the present time he doesn't seem to be willing to entertain any counterarguments. 1185. COVID-19 aphorism. To think there are millions of people around the world who listen to the incessant reports about a health threat and never stop to think this might be the unhealthiest thing of all. 1186. The default position of people on the left who, roughly speaking, are city dwellers seems to be that those on the right are not as pure-minded and well-motivated as they are. However, if there were a severe food shortage which the country folk themselves were not responsible for but did all in their power to alleviate, it would probably undergo a sea change. 1187. COVID-19 aphorism. In their infinite wisdom, the governments of the world have declared that all their citizens should keep themselves safe from the coronavirus even if this makes them sick in all other ways. 1188. The main advantage of the truth over the long term is that it's a prevailing wind hard to resist. 1189. COVID-19 aphorism. Now that they've got us lining up like zombies and programmed to do away with smiles and close contact, tell me, as you've done so many times before, good sir, how we should all come together as one global community. 1190. COVID-19 aphorism. Is there anything more curious than all these people who, wearing protective masks while playing with their smartphones, combine modern-day amulets with latest technology? 1191. When television first came into being, it was hailed as the future teacher of the masses. It was a utopian view that couldn't envision a dystopian outcome, despite George Orwell's 1984 coming out about the same time. 1192. COVID-19 aphorism. A sign of the increased public awareness about health issues since the outbreak of the coronavirus, a man going up to a clerk in a grocery store and buying a carton of cigarettes while wearing his mask. 1193. COVID-19 aphorism. Never in the field of human leadership have so few made such a mess for so many. 1194. COVID-19 aphorism. Would anyone not have thought even 6 months ago that introducing widespread antisocial practices wasn't a good thing? 1195. COVID-19 aphorism. Here's the title of a future book whose subject matter is fairly easy to predict: Children who grow up under social distancing and mask wearing, the psychological consequences. 1196. COVID-19 aphorism. When various institutions, governmental, political, educational, commercial, loudly proclaim they are taking certain measures to protect the public, it's almost certain what they really wish to protect are themselves, but not so much as a group of individuals as a functioning entity, a sustaining environment, a means of livelihood, a privileged habitat. 1197. An issue or problem has been politicized when both sides are absolutely certain who's right and who's wrong, and, a close second, who's good and who's evil. 1198. Science is the best and most up-to-date knowledge we have on a matter. What it isn't is the final word on anything except for those who have turned it into a religion. 1199. What many protesters seem to want when they go out onto the streets to protest is a perfect world to run rampant. 1200. Wisdom out of foolishness. When we argue with someone over a matter we think we know well, when we pursue it at length with a person we consider to be no fool but stubborn enough not to fall in line with our way of thinking, we ourselves might play the fool by giving full rein to our presumed mastery of the subject and, as a consequence, find it also to be one of which we are to some degree ignorant.